You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
On the attack on Pozières. The Battle of Pozières Ridge lasted 6 weeks. In that time, the 1st Anzac Corps, in whose sector most of the fighting took place, advanced the British line just over a mile and a half. At its conclusion, the fighting around Pozières resulted in modest gains and an enormous casualty rate. The events at Pozières in July and August 1916 were representative of the average day on the Somme. What was the purpose of the Somme Campaign? And what was significant about the fight for Pozières? Why is the battle significant for the 1st Anzac Corps? And why is it significant for Australia's military history? Today, I'm wandering around the grounds of the Australian War Memorial, and my guest will hopefully help me answer some of these questions. My guest today is Dr. Meleah Hampton. Meleah is a historian in the military history section of the Australian War Memorial. She is a graduate of the University of Adelaide, but we won't hold that against her. She completed her PhD with a thesis on the 1916 battles for Pozières and Meleah Farm. She is a member of the editorial staff of the War Memorial's magazine, Wartime, and, while pursuing a range of historical interests, continues to research and write biographies for the Last Post Ceremony project. I luckily have been a beneficiary of one of these biographies, having read the biography of the Barr brothers at the centenary of Fromelles. Her primary interest is in the operational conduct of the First World War on the Western Front. Meleah is the author of Attack on the Somme, 1st Anzac Corps and the Battle of Pozières Ridge, 1916. She has also contributed a number of book chapters and articles on the conduct of warfare on the Western Front. Meleah, thanks for hosting me here at the War Memorial today and coming on the show for a chat.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's a real pleasure to contribute to your podcast.
Meleah, you're a historian at the Australian War Memorial. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your work?
Well, obviously the War Memorial's 3 different things. We're a memorial, a museum and an archive, and so history underpins a great deal of what we do, and my role as a historian is to contribute to those sorts of things, speeches, exhibitions that we have, and all sorts of things, as well as writing, continuing to research and write on Australian military history.
Now, Meleah, your background wasn't originally as a historian. You came via way of veterinary practice as a nurse. How did you enter the world of military history?
I've always been interested in Australia's military history, went from a small child for reasons I don't understand. But when I left school, I didn't think it was a feasible career path, so I became a veterinary nurse. And since then, I used veterinary nursing to travel overseas and spent a lot of time in Europe. And I found that most of my holidays were to battlefields. And when you're hauling a tent around the battlefields because you could spend money on the car hire so you can get to more places rather than accommodation, I think it's time to go and study it properly. That's why I went back to university, or I went to university when I got back to Australia. And I was very fortunate to have people like Robin Pryor come back to Adelaide Uni and supervise me, and I loved it and I got a long way with it. So here I am.
It's quite an interesting journey, moving from history as an interest to an academic pursuit to a career. Now you're a published author, you've got your own book, and for those listeners who didn't realise, the centenary of the Somme is now, and centenary is a 100-year anniversary. I know some of my listeners may struggle with that concept, but Meleah's book was actually launched last week to much fanfare. We didn't hold a parade in the street though because of budgetary constraints. Now, as I said, it is the centenary of the Somme Campaign. In particular, we have seen significant commemorations at Fromelles and Pozières in France. Now, I say significant because I'm Australian. They were significant battles for the Australian forces on the Western Front. Can you give me a brief description of how these two particular battles are linked?
The short answer is that they're not actually linked at all, almost at all. They are linked together on a macro level in that the Somme Campaign is the major British effort during the war for 1916, and there was a hope that by conducting this small set-piece attack a long way away, it might tie up German reserves and stop them from feeding their forces on the Somme or beyond towards Verdun. Beyond that, operationally, there's no relation. The 5th Australian Division that conducted the attack at Fromelles was in 2nd Anzac Corps. They are completely separate from the other 3 Australian divisions on the Western Front at the time, the 1st, 2nd and 4th. They are in 2nd Anzac Corps, and the two aren't a homogenous Australian force. They are doing their own things. In fact, the 2nd Imperial Corps, which is next door to the Australians at Pozières, probably have a closer relationship with those Australian divisions than the 5th does at the time. But I was thinking about this, and I think there is an important way that they are related, and that is that the casualty lists from both arrive in Australia at the same time. So for people in towns and cities around Australia, they can be quite mixed because I suppose you don't really care if the guys die at Fromelles or Pozières necessarily, and we find them mixed up on Red Cross Roll of Honour cards often. They say they die in Pozières and they were at Fromelles or vice versa. So there's a link in that way, but really, as far as the conduct of the war goes, is a very macro link and nothing to do with Australian-ness of either effort.
It's a very interesting link, as we can see with some of our other commemorations, that as the legend of these types of activities and actions grow, it's the remembering that may change the actual operational fact. I find that's why books such as yours are important for those of us interested in military history and those interested in learning a little bit more about war and warfare, is that remembering is not always the same wherever you are. And whilst Fromelles and Pozières may be linked in the Australian psyche in remembering war, they're not necessarily linked in the operational design of the actions that were carried out at the time. Now, your book, which I've already plugged at the start, but I'll plug again, which is Attack on the Somme, just released last week, sold out, great fanfare. Listeners can grab it at any of the online bookstores that I normally look at, and I'll tell you about those later. It talks about the 1st Anzac Corps battle for Pozières Ridge. Can you describe that battle for our listeners?
Yeah, it's a 6-week campaign. It's 6 weeks from start to finish exactly. At the beginning, they attack, the 1st Australian Division attacks and captures this tactically significant village of Pozières. It sits on the high ground, and it affords a good view into both the British and German lines, so it's an important position to hold. And it takes about 2 or 3 days to effect its full capture, and that's quite significant for the British Army as a whole to have actually taken that. But from that point onwards, things go a little bit awry. They have to turn to the right and attack the OG lines, which are the main German lines of defence in the area, and they do so at a great human cost for quite specific tactical reasons. They're not relying on artillery and firepower, they're relying on manpower to conduct the advance, and it's 7,000 casualties in a very short period of time. They then turn back towards the northwest and start moving towards Mouquet Farm, which we consider to be the next phase of their operation. And they just sort of attack and fail. They're not actually attacking Mouquet Farm though, they're attacking in very limited fashion the next trench, the next strong post towards it, and they really only attack the German stronghold inside Mouquet Farm in the last few days of their campaign, and both of those operations fail with quite heavy costs as well.
So just to elaborate on some of those operational issues, being an artilleryman myself, I always find it interesting when the use of artillery is limited, particularly in some of these World War I battles. I know in the August offensive in Gallipoli, the use of artillery was limited for various reasons. Why was there a limit? Because when I think of the Western Front, and this may be a pop culture reading or harking back to a distant memory in my room during undergrad days, it seemed to be an artilleryman's battle. So how come there was limited fire support?
It's really important to remember when we talk about the First World War, we're talking about a revolution in artillery tactics. So they began the war expecting to wheel their artillery into the front line in line with their infantry and just fire at stuff they were looking at. And they very quickly worked out that if you do that, the Germans will pick off all of your guns and that will be the end of your artillery. So they had to withdraw behind hills and hide their artillery. And we think, oh, well, good, just fire at that then. But actually firing at something you couldn't see was really difficult. There are some fantastic photos of forward observation officers all perched on the same tree because they were all given one gun each to report on the fall of shell. And so they're all, they had to even work out if you're going to have someone observe the fall of shell, how do you do that in an effective manner instead of having 15 guys all hanging around the same area? So everything is a problem. Hitting something you can't see, communicating about what you can't see when you hit it, how best to deploy it to support your infantry, all of those things start from zero, really, and they're working their way out. So particularly for the British, the battles of 1915 around Neuve-Chapelle inform a lot of approaches. There's a lot of experimenting and in some cases to very good effect, but they don't know which is good and which is bad because there are so many factors that can affect a battle. You'll know that, so many things can go wrong at so many levels of command or all over the place that it's hard to identify what's effective about the artillery or not. So 1916 gives them a smorgasbord of choices. Do we do a creeping barrage? Do we do just an early bombardment and then lift off? What do we do? And at Pozières, in the first battle, they do actually fire a very effective lifting barrage that protects the infantry very well, leads them right up to the edge of the village and enables them to actually start infiltrating German strongpoints. That doesn't happen further on. They start doing quite different things with their artillery and it all goes downhill quite quickly.
I think the lesson for anyone who's instructed me in gunnery and observation is that it may not have been my particular skill at the time, but that indirect fire observation is hard. But also it's interesting to know that there was a successful technique used at the outset and then they started to differ from that. And it's always the benefits of hindsight to question these things. But gaining on an adaptation or a new innovation, the way that certain technologies are applied in battle, is something that was a strong lesson from the First World War, and we start to see that later on in the war. With regards to this particular battle, you're a historian at the Australian War Memorial. There's a lot of things that you get opportunities to write about, but you chose to do your in-depth study on this particular battle. So for me, I find it interesting and fascinating that you dedicated a large part of your life and time towards researching this particular battle. To me, that means that there must be something significant about it in itself. So, for our listeners, what did you find significant about it? And why is it worth our listeners reflecting upon?
Well, I should say I started this before I was employed at the War Memorial. It's come out of my PhD thesis. I chose the topic because there is just a wealth of source material to be used. During the First World War, our official war correspondent and then later the official war historian, Charles Bean, was really desperate to save everything and record this for posterity and not lose anything. So for the 1916 battles, he just seemed to have swept all of the messages in battle into a box and they've been glued into books later. And we have them all, significant percentage of them. I looked through more than 10,000 messages. So I can tell you where they were supposed to leave their greatcoats on their way into Pozières. But also there's some really interesting information that's come out of just going through and putting them in chronological order and see who's writing to whom and how they respond. Down to the point where I can talk about individuals and the difference an individual can make during the course of a technologically driven battle. And that's really important for our understanding of the war, not because we're Australians and we want to know that Australians were good. Actually, it's important because the Australian forces are part of the British Army as a whole. They function within British corps and British armies, and they are employing British methods underneath all of that. So what you find is then the Australians become one of the best examples of British units as far as our archives go. we can actually describe warfare in ways that, potentially people studying the King's Own Yeoman's light infantry can't, because they didn't keep those records. And I'm always interested to discuss this in terms of the British and the way they've conducted their battles on the Somme. And what the Australians are doing are just another day on the Somme, not the big battles, not the 1st of July, not the 14th of July or the 15th of September, but the other 138 days of small-scale, limited objective attacks all along the Somme front.
Now, some have stated that we may be entering a period of centenary fatigue. A recent talk given at the Lowy Institute stated things like Australia has taken the commemoration in a very different way than Europe has, and the UK itself, and therefore the length of time that we've extended the First World War commemorations may be building in a fatigue that may lose some of the importance of the message that places such as the War Memorial are trying to remind people about the cost of such a war. Why are campaigns like the Somme and the battles that were fought as part of that campaign, why are they important to commemorate?
Well, talking about commemoration fatigue, we do talk about it, and I've got to say I'm not seeing it. We did, certainly our biggest year of commemoration was 2015, and that's to be expected. The Brits, for example, didn't do a great deal with 2015 or the Gallipoli campaigns or Neuve Chapelle or anything of that, because their big year of remembrance is the Somme, so they're doing it this year. And so there's always going to be a year of emphasis amongst these forces and amongst these countries and their commemoration activities, but we still are seeing record numbers at last post ceremonies and people coming. For me personally, I don't care if people are tired of commemorating. That's okay. We don't actually have to make people commemorate at all times. The War Memorial is always here. It's been here since the 40s, and we will continue to be here for those who want to come, learn and engage with this as a topic. And if people don't want to, that's okay too. That's not a problem. But we certainly aren't seeing any drop off at all.
It's very interesting to note that the War Memorial isn't seeing a drop-off. When people talk about commemoration fatigue, perhaps they're probably talking from maybe even just a personal standpoint, because for those listeners that don't know, I'm based in Canberra, so I come to the War Memorial every now and then, sometimes to have coffee with the historians that work here, sometimes to read a biography at the last post ceremony. And for those who haven't come along to a last post ceremony, it is where the War Memorial closes for the evening, and a biography is read out in commemoration of someone who was a casualty of war in Australia's history. I've had the opportunity to read 2 biographies at 2 ceremonies this year, and I've found it to be one of the most rewarding things that you can do in terms of commemorating the sacrifice of others. So if you are based in Canberra, come along to a last post ceremony. You'll find that the War Memorial is constantly abuzz with lots and lots of visitors. And you'll also find, for those involved in Pokemon Go, that there's lots of Pokemon spots around here as well. Yeah,
I'm not talking to you about Pokemon Go. I'm not going there at all. However, I would say that my primary interest in studying the war is always operations. I sort of came out of my teenage interest and the sorrow and the loss and everything to reading great operational historians like Robin Pryor and Trevor Wilson, and realising that you can really endeavour to understand what happened and really get down to nuts and bolts and gun counting and all the rest of it. So that's always my interest. But when I started here, I was a newbie and it was a new project and it was an obvious marriage. So I have written a lot of last post ceremonies, and it's been very rewarding to put a story to just a brass name on our wall and actually give them a story and a background, and then B, pass it off to the public and I don't have to think about it anymore. But it does populate my own work when I talk about thousands of casualties or, the effects of this artillery barrage, and being able to put an individual to that experience has been really rewarding for me too.
Now, Meleah, Pokemon aside, last post ceremonies aside, I do hope that you write the next biography I read, because it was very well written. Terrible tragedy, as each of these biographies are. But we'll move to the final question of the Dead Prussian. It's often a feared question from my guests, because they know they're not allowed to give the answer Big Carl gave, which is the only answer people seem to draw from Big Carl, even though he defines war several times through that book in many, many different ways. And what we seek to do on this show is to continue to study war and to define war. We're never going to be definitive, unlike the Macquarie Dictionary. We are always seeking new, fresh answers. And if they can be tweeted, that's just a bonus. But answering this question is the price you must pay to appear on such a prestigious podcast. And as you know, we are a 5-star podcast and the most well-known podcast on war and warfare that is named after a Prussian theorist from the 19th century. I therefore ask you to finish the sentence, war is.
War is a really dirty business. That's the only way to talk about it. It costs lives, it costs material, it costs the wealth of nations in some cases. It's a really dirty business, and it's always a really regrettable business. It's certainly not to be celebrated, but sometimes it's a necessary business. It's unavoidable in some cases.
That is a new and, I would say, frank explanation of war. War is a dirty business. Best thing is the Twitter army can get behind that and start tweeting that one, because it is well within 140 characters. Some of the interviews I've done around this location this week were much, much longer in their definitions, but we won't criticise them because their episode will come out after yours anyway, and the listeners won't know what I'm talking about, as usual. Meleah, thank you very much for coming on the show, also hosting me here at the Australian War Memorial. Good luck with the book. I think it's great that we're seeing books on 1916 come out during the centenary, and as my listeners now know, that means 100 years later. The book is Attack on the Somme, the first Anzac Corps on the battle for Pozières Ridge, 1916. If you want to read the book, listeners, you can jump online, check out any of the online stores. I had a quick glance of Book Depository and Amazon.com, the American site, because the Australian site only sells electronic books. I'm sure it's out there. I do know that the hard copies sold very, very well at the conference on 1916 here last week, so you may not find any here at the War Memorial, but give it time, and I'm sure they'll be in their 2nd, 3rd, maybe 20th edition in future. Please jump on board and also throw a few stars the Dead Prussians way on iTunes. The more stars you throw at me, let's say 5 for each review, means the wider the conversation can get, the wider the discussion, and the more people I get to meet and interview. It also fulfills my egotistic need to have people listen to me. Keep an eye on the website. You'll start to see some more book reviews pop up on the website, and there'll be a new War Diary post published very, very soon. Meleah, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you very much. Long live the dead Prussian.
And listeners, until next time, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at The Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.